Well, thank you very much, Vit, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. Can everyone hear me well? Very good. Yes, I'm happy to be with this crowd of liberty-loving people. Well, I take you're all liberty-loving. Are there any socialists in the room? No? I saw a hand there. No problem at all. I love to speak to socialists too. And Fit already announced that I'm going to talk about democracy, and this is based on the book that I co-authored, Beyond Democracy. It's now in 20 languages. I brought some copies with me. It's also in Serbian, and I brought a few copies in Slovak or Czech language. So you can buy them for a low price. And this is an interesting topic, I think, for people like us, liberty-loving people, because does democracy equate liberty? That's people are told, and I believe that too. But after investigating in this, I came to quite different conclusions. So that is the topic of my talk, and it consists of three parts. First, I will explain what the Western democracies, actually the most successful democracy, is suffering from. And we now notice that in the EU area, but also in the United States. And I will show you long-term graphs, long-term trends. And this is not proof that it is because of democracy, but in the second part, I will try to explain why it correlates very strongly with the democratic principles and the democratic dynamics. And in the third part, I will try to explain an alternative based on a more liberty-minded approach. Like most people, most people I know, they believe very strongly in democracy. And when I was, 20 years back, I believed what the media told me and the politicians and the educational system, that we thank our freedom, our prosperity and our tolerance and peace to democracy. And little did I know about democracy. But once I investigated, and thanks to the works also by Hans Hermann Hoppe and other libertarians, I came to quite different conclusions. Democracy is pretty much opposite of what people tell us it is, and it doesn't lead to liberty. And so I think this is an important message. And the funny thing is that normally I talk about the downsides of democracy, but without me knowing it, my talk was announced as the merits and downfalls of democracy. And so I was thinking quite hard about the merits. I don't have many, but maybe in the Q&A section, my talk will about 30 minutes. You can enlighten me a bit more about the merits, but I have one. But for the rest of it, it's pretty much downfalls, I think. So there is a lot of disillusionment with voters, and they're angry and frustrated, but they do not blame democracy, they blame politicians. So I'll get into that later too. But the good thing is the cracks are now beginning to show. The renowned magazine, The Economist, had a cover article 2 years back with, like you could see, and they identified the cracks are beginning to show. And in the European Union, we hardly have any growth. We have social conflict. We have rising debts. And especially in the southern European countries, we see, great upheaval. And so apparently it doesn't seem to work as advertised. So I'm going to show you about 5 or 6 graphs that indicate that the Western democracies are quite in some problem. And one of them is the rising taxes. In 1 century of democracy, taxes have risen as a percentage of GDP from about 12% 100 years ago to around 50%. This is on average, and very few people know that, because the income tax is of course not 50%, but there are hundreds of taxes, and they are taken from you stealthily. So, but this is the reality. And this compares very unfavorably to Hong Kong and Singapore, which are non-democracies. Another thing is, and few people know this, the regulatory growth in the United States has increased 200-fold in 1 century of democracy. And you might think, oh well, who cares? I'm not, I'm not bothered by all this regulation in my country. I don't notice that, but indirectly you will. 99.5% of all laws and regulations didn't exist 100 years ago. And this, of course, is an incursion in our freedom because they micromanage our lives. And it is estimated and calculated by some economists that if the US regulation, and this is supposedly a country with very little regulation and the land of the free, but if the regulation would have stopped growing in 1950, people would be twice as prosperous. And you would say, well, I don't care about money. Well, you do care probably about leisure time. It means that you could have, worked instead of 5 days, 2.5 days, and earned the same amount of money. So it's an enormous burden on our society. Another thing which shows a very strong trend in democracies is the enormous growth of the welfare state. The UK, for instance, spends about 30% of GDP on welfare, and that includes healthcare too and stuff. But that's about 60% of their budget, of the government budget, and more people are, dependent on the welfare state. They even in the United States, where they say, where it is said that the welfare state is minimal. Well, not according to this graph. The other thing is that democracies cannot, protect us very well from the inflation of the money. 96% of the dollar has been evaporated of the value in 1 century of democracy. And well, you notice that with increasingly or continuously higher prices. And I think this is a very telling graph too, the fifth one, an end to growth. As we could have seen in the last decade, the economic growth in the EU area has been almost flat. And we think this is unique. Well, actually, if you knew this graph, you could have predicted it, because this is a part of a long-term trend of the main Western democracies. This includes America and Japan and Western Europe. And many people respond to me and they say, well, when you get more prosperous, growth is more difficult to establish. But if you look at countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, they're still in the 3%, 4%, 5% growth per year. And Singaporeans per capita earn more now per year than the average American. And this is remarkable because the United States had a head start of about 150 years. So there's an enormous voter disillusionment. This is a cartoon. STD stands for sexually transmitted diseases, if you don't know. So voter turnout is in the West continuously decreasing, as the graph indicates. But also membership of political parties is far less popular than it was, let's say, 50 years ago. So people are frustrated, and they don't seem to blame politicians. Oh, they do blame politicians, but not democracy. They get very angry. And I would say, don't get angry with politicians. This is not good. It's bad for your health. It's bad for your heart. I stopped doing that. And because I now better understand the dynamics and the principles of democracy, I cured my own frustration with politics. And I hope that works for you too. So you should blame the system. And I'm trying to explain in the book and in my talks and articles that there's something fundamentally wrong with democracy. And it cannot lead to good results. So why is that? That is because democracy is not, kind of a neutral system. It's collectivism. It's the idea that we can and almost, often must decide on virtually anything in society collectively, and then that the decision should be followed by anyone, everyone, also the people who are against it. And this means that the individual is subordinate to the wishes of the collective, just as with communism and fascism. Yes, it's a harsh statement, but it is true, I think. And so democracy suffers, because it's collectivism, from the same problems as socialism. Centralization, loss of liberty, corruption, bureaucracy, economic stagnation, and we see that. So, and you don't have to take my word for it. This is a picture of Karl Marx. You must have recognized him. He said democracy is the road to socialism. And he was actually quite modest regarding that, because the United States Socialist Party, and I'm not talking about Bernie Sanders, but a more extreme form, they say that democracy and socialism are one and indivisible. And of course this is understandable, because they like this redistribution part of democracy. So I'm now going to go to the second part, and I'm trying to explain why the principles and dynamics of democracy lead to the negative results. And one of them, well, it's actually very obvious, is that the politicians in our democracy, or in any democracy, have a very short-term perspective. They can, they can enter into bad laws, or raise taxes or print money, and they know that the negative effects in the long run will have to be dealt with by their successors and not by them. And they get the benefits if they print money, or if they borrow money, or they act like Santa Claus. And you can see that in this graph, that Obama raked in more debt than his predecessor and stuff. So, and of course their successors have the same perverse incentive to think about the present and not about the future. And if you will now look at what politicians do, and you think, you have this in your background, you understand this is a very strong incentive for them. And again, you can't really blame them, because it's within their reach. The second thing is that democracy is often portrayed as a system where the people protect themselves against the government. But this is not quite true. There's not the people with one voice, with one idea. There are millions of people with different ideas. And in a democracy, it is allowed to try to put your personal goals on the collective tab. And I don't know if you can read it, but all these people try to live at the expense of others. And they say, I want free welfare, or I want subsidies, and I want them to pay for it. And if you listen especially to Bernie Sanders, for instance, in the United States, you say, well, vote for me and I'll take the money away from someone else. And so there's this continuous infighting. Another thing is that they say that democracy protects the people from the government or from the rulers, but actually the reverse is true. This is a picture of Tony Blair, and he's blamed for participating in the Iraq war because of weapons of mass destruction which weren't there under false pretenses. And he can get away with it. He doesn't even get a slap on the wrist. There will be libraries named after him, probably, just as with George Bush. And so they can print money till there are no trees left standing. They can break election promises with impunity. And so actually it protects the rulers from the people. And the only thing you can do is vote for someone else, but the choice is very limited. So democracy is just not a very good system to contain or direct or control government. They can get away with a lot. So, and democracy, this is one of the big fallacies of democracy, that is equated with liberty. And actually, it should be so obvious that it's not, because you're not free if the majority tells you what to do. And liberty is about individual liberty, in my opinion. And I come from the Netherlands, and I don't consider it a free country. We don't have freedom of contract. We don't have freedom of healthcare. You don't have freedom to talk to your physician and say, well, I have this disease, let's have this treatment. With a tenant and a landlord, there's no freedom of contract. You cannot decide on the price. So you don't have freedom of education. The government tells you what to do and what teachers should teach and what they should pay. And, well, there are tons of rules. So in the United States, for instance, the land of the free, there are about 700, well, there are 2,700,000 people incarcerated at this moment. And about 50% is incarcerated because of drug offenses. And half of them, or something, is incarcerated because of non-violent drug offenses. So this is about 700,000 that are in jail. And, well, they have the right to vote, but are they free? I don't think so. So, and the government takes 50% of our money and decides how it should be spent. So another thing is that democracy should breed prosperity, and I don't think that is correct. In India, for instance, which is the largest democracy in the world, people are relatively poor. It's getting better now, but not thanks to democracy, because of more economic freedom. Whereas non-democracies like Hong Kong and Singapore are doing quite well. And I think democracy can be compared to, let's say, 100 people that go out for dinner and decide to split the bill evenly afterwards, or in advance they decide that. And of course everybody had this very strong incentive to overspend, because if you have you probably experienced it yourself, but if you order this dessert of 10 euros, for instance, then you know you only have to pay 10 cents, and the rest is for the other people. But since everyone has that incentive, the collective bill, the final tab will be enormous. And with 1 million people, that is even worse. So even if you are rational, you think, well, I should engage in this madness, because otherwise I don't have my dessert. So, and people say, well, and this will be a talk, we'll talk about it more, as I've understood, about how could a constitution work to limit the powers of the governments. And I think I don't have much faith in constitutions, although they can play a role like a contract, but they are made of paper, as you all know, and they don't have a brain or a gun. They cannot enforce themselves. And in the Netherlands, where I come from, we have a constitution that is more like a social democratic pamphlet. So redistribution is part and parcel of it. Whereas the United States has a more strict constitution, and you could see where that led to. I mean, the trends are pretty much the same. They can misinterpret it, they can amend it, they can totally ignore it. So who's going to protect the Constitution? And so what's the alternative? People say, well, the only we can imaginable alternative is something horrible, that's dictatorship. And that's not true, because if we would decide on buying your car democratically, and I would object to that, you wouldn't say, well, you want a dictator telling you what to buy. And I say, no, everybody buys his own car and pays for it. So the alternative to voting with your pencil, what we do in a democracy, is to vote with your feet, what we do in a market. So for that we need decentralization, but also we should acknowledge that we don't use democracy in so many parts of our lives. We don't use it in business. Otherwise, people wouldn't say, well, I'll take an employer, I'll hire one, because that's risky. We don't use it in families, otherwise people wouldn't, parents wouldn't have more than one child. And we don't use it in science. We don't use it when we do our groceries, and that works wonderful. So I'd like to indicate that voting with your feet is so much more superior to voting with your pencil. Suppose we would vote for bakeries or for bread, then if you wouldn't like the bread, people would start petitions and say protests and gathering signatures, and they would get angry, and they would see the people who like bread, different bread from their own, as their enemies. It would create antagonism. Whereas nowadays, if you don't like your bread, you just go to a different baker, which is fantastic. You vote with your feet, and that creates peace and a variety of products. So option A as an alternative is decentralization. And why do I mention that? It's still democracy, but if we have a lot of democracies, people can easily vote with their feet. And the reason why the Swiss democracy is working quite well is that it consists of 25 cantons, like provinces. The average size is 250,000 inhabitants, and they have a lot of autonomy still, although it's eroding, in the realms of education and taxes and education. But also here the trends are towards more centralization, towards higher taxes, so that's not good. So the problem is we need decentralization, we need more countries. And there's a special club in this world, a very exclusive one, and it only has 200 members. And they don't allow new members very easily. And we call them countries. And these countries, they have a lot of privileges. They can print money, they can boss their people around, and make laws, and go into debt. And that is a problem, because this is not really a market, it's more like a cartel, and we need to break that cartel, and that's why Liberland is such a great idea. Because there is enough space in this world. I mean, the total surface area of the globe, the land surface, is 150 million square kilometers, and Liberland is less than 1/1,000,000th of that. Monaco, where the following speaker is coming from, is even smaller. It's 2 square kilometers. So there's an abundance of space on this earth, but autonomy is very hard to come by, and that is a problem we need to solve for a market for governance to work better. So with that decentralization, we have far more choice. And now the customer lock-in for citizens is enormous. If I want a different system, I would probably have to learn a new language. I would have to say goodbye to my family, etc., and friends. So another world with far more jurisdictions or countries could look like this. And many states are doing very well. Of the 20 most prosperous countries in the world, 15 of them are microstates. So, and one great example that really inspired me was China with the special economic zones. And Shenzhen is one of the most known of those. And in 1976, Mao Zedong died after 30 years of reign, something like that. 40 million casualties of hunger, of oppression, murder. And his successor, Deng Xiaoping, he visited Singapore, which was established in 1965 as a small new country. And Singapore was an enormous success economically. And he was inspired by that. And 2 years later, in 1980, he started the first 4 special economic zones, of which Shenzhen was one. And after 4 years, in 1984, it was clear that this was a great success. And they built 14 more. And in 1990, they were so convinced that they had another 20. So this inspired the rest, or the rulers, to grant more liberties to the rest of China. And so this is an indication that big changes can start small. So we need startup countries, and on the left you see Dubai, which just about 20 years back or 25 years back was a barren desert, and now is a very successful city or emirate. And I hope the same would apply to Liberland, so that in 10, 15 years we can see the artist rendering on the right. So the option B is to privatization of governance, and actually that is a fantastic idea. I think that's even better than a special economic zone. It means that you would not have to deal with the government, but you would have to deal with a company that provides you with the basic governmental services, like security, infrastructure, and justice. And not one of you has a contract with your respective government stipulating what to do. So it leads to a lot of legal uncertainty. And the following speaker, Titus Gebel, will elaborate on that. So I won't go into that any much further. So we would see a contractual society in which has contracts that would stipulate what to pay and what you would get in return. And otherwise, such a company would never get a customer, just like an insurance company would never get customers if they say, well, what you have to pay next year is very uncertain, and what you're going to get in return is very uncertain. And that is pretty much what governments do, and they can get away with it because there's this customer lock-in. And with companies, that is not the case. So it would mark a significant shift in how governance is done. It would go from temporary caretakers to owners. It would go from elections to contracts, from short-term thinking to long-term thinking, from citizen to customer. And I think that is a great prospect if we can pull that off. So in conclusion, I think it's clear that democracy won't work. You can vote for another person, and the dynamics are such that this will not lead to better results. The politicians are pretty much the emperors with no clothes. Continuously say, well, okay, there are huge problems, and maybe we created them we created them ourselves. But just give us more money, give us more power, and we will solve it. And of course, this never happens. So it's important to acknowledge that. Don't rely on democracy to change it. Don't change the old, start the new. And that's why I'm so enthusiastic about Liberland or similar ideas, because they will start the new. And that's why I wish Liberland to prosper in the future. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left for a Q&A. Maybe you have merits of democracy. I have one. I can start with one, and you can follow. Well, I'll get back to you after my point. Thank you. And well, one is that it facilitates the peaceful transition of power, and that's a good thing. It's not minor. The only thing is that the power is pretty much the same. If you look at Obama and Bush, they both started foreign wars. They both, increased the regulatory burden, and they both increased taxes. So that would be my reply. But maybe you, sir?
Well, no. My question to you is somewhat related to that. But I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. As far as I understand, regarding personal liberties, countries with higher levels of democracy, although they do have far lower economic liberties, which is rather obvious. It takes certain knowledge to understand that. Personal liberties, in respect to what you are allowed to do with your body, freedom of speech and stuff like that, I may be wrong, but as far as I perceive, it's on a higher level in countries that have more developed democracies. Hong Kong and Singapore cannot say that they have a higher level in respect to other European countries. And I had another point, but I forgot it. But never mind.
Well, let me take this point first. Well, I don't think personal liberty is pretty high regarding some aspects in the Netherlands, for instance, which is a typical Western democracy and quite successful at it. I mean, but homeschooling, for instance, I know of Germany that there are people seeking asylum, I think in the United States, because they ran the risk of being incarcerated or children taken away because they wanted to homeschool their children. Another thing is, I think it's very good that, for instance, in the Netherlands, which was one of the initiators, we have, gays are allowed to get married. Whatever you might think of that, I think it is their right. But the other thing is that you have nowadays these anti-discrimination laws, whereas, for instance, in the United States, there was this Christian baker who refused to bake a cake for a gay couple who wanted to get married. Another thing is, for instance, and you could not have made this up, I think, 100 years ago, that this was, and these people were fined about $100,000. Another example is also regarding the incursions of personal freedom, is that there was this Christian Mingle website in California, and they were forced to also allow gay people to connect with each other. And of course, you have so many people in the United States, but also in the Netherlands, who are incarcerated because of drug laws. So, yes, in some regards, personal liberty is pretty good in the West, but I don't think it's as good as people think it is.
Would you allow for a follow-up?
Sure.
Would you allow a follow-up?
Well, maybe we don't have. You can talk to me later on. I'll be glad to answer your question, but our time is limited.
My question would be about this new thing called Bitcoin. How would you add Bitcoin as the possible solution, adding to all the problems that you have kind of listed? Do you know about Bitcoin?
Yes.
Okay.
I read it on your shirt. No, I love Bitcoin too, just like you, and I think it's great, and I think it has a good future. The same applies to the blockchain, which is the underlying technology, but I don't see it. I can see people escaping from the fiat currencies that our governments are pushing upon us. So that's a good thing. We can escape. But I don't see it...
but as a solution to tie the hand of government?
I don't see that now. But we can talk about it later after the presentation. Anyone, please? I see you first and then I come to you.
I have also had my various moments of disillusionment with democracy, but I think unlike the perception that I got from your talk, my conclusion was not that democracy exists and rules us because some people are stupid or some people believe things that are not true and we should only show them the way, or that it was somebody's mistake. To me, I think it's fairly clear that democracy came about mostly as a result of a big shift in technology, namely the appearance of firearms and the biometric rifle, for example, which made pretty sure that usually the larger army won. So anybody can be trained to be a soldier with these firearms relatively quickly, at least much quicker than the lifelong training required by the medieval weapons to be effective. And because of that, as you have just said, the outcome of the Civil War is pretty well predicted by anonymous voting, and therefore it's just cheaper to do the Civil War than the ballot box, but it's still a Civil War. And I'm wondering what. So I believe that this is the case, that the more people usually win over the fewer people, technically, militarily, and therefore, democracy came about as a sequence of civil wars, be it the French Revolution or the American Revolution or things like that. And I think that in order to get rid of that, we should somehow show what is it precisely that is going to take this power out of democracy, namely that mass violence is seen as legitimate. So if a large number of people go into the streets and do violence, they usually succeed. And I think this is the practical basis of democracy. It's not some books or ideas. It's just how it is.
Could you rephrase that into?
So the question now is, what has changed? What do you think is going to change that will allow us to move away from democracy, so that large mobs just cannot rule over us?
Well, we need the safety valve, which the market has a safety valve, which means that if a company becomes too powerful and starts raising their prices, at the bottom, new companies can form, no matter how small they are. The same should apply to governance. We need safety valve in governance, which you don't have now, and Liberland is one of the safety valves. So I cannot predict it will happen. I am confident it will happen, but not certain. But this is the way forward, and political change through the democratic system will not happen. It's a socialist game. Politicians always win, and I'm afraid I have to finish my talk now because I ran out of time. So, but if you come to me and ask your questions afterwards, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you very much.